Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for coming on this cold but still no snow day in Washington, D.C. I'm delighted to be here. I'm Paul Glastris, editor-in-chief of the Washington Monthly magazine. And I first want to thank New America for making their space here available, and our partners on many things. Also, the Kellogg Foundation for making the issue of the magazine and this event possible. We're going to be talking today with a very distinguished panel of writers and experts on one of the most fundamental issues in American history and American politics, and one that gets talked about much less than it should, and that is race in America. A few days ago, President Barack Obama put his hand on the Lincoln and Martin Luther King Bibles and took the oath of office almost exactly 150 years since the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. And in his inaugural speech, he talked movingly about this country's historic and continuing march for greater freedom. So given the tremendous importance of this moment, we at the Washington Monthly thought it appropriate to devote this issue of the magazine to the subjects of race, history, and the conditions of minorities in America today. We've been joined by Taylor Branch. We're so delighted that Amtrak got its act together and delivered him here. Ladies and gentlemen, Taylor Branch.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. First of all, I want to, I do not want to pay tribute to the MARC commuter lines, but I do want to give thanks that I was not one of the stories where you're on for 8 hours and no bathrooms and all that. I was only on for a little over 2 extra hours, and I'm glad to be here. More importantly, I want to pay tribute to the Washington Monthly, my first job, my first boss, over 40 years ago. For this issue, I think it's extraordinary. I'm happy and pleased to be with these fellow contributors to this issue. I think it's an amazing thing to concentrate a whole issue recognizing such a pregnant, such a resonant convergence of anniversaries here. If you're looking back at 1863, in many respects 1913, 50 years after that, you had the first Southerner, Woodrow Wilson, since the Civil War elected president, who not only introduced segregation into the federal government and into Washington, D.C., and maintained a general aura in memory as a liberal and an internationalist, but he also, in many respects, gave a great impetus to the foundations of Hollywood by praising The Birth of the Nation at a screening in the White House as history written in lightning, which is a profound misrememberment of the civil rights era. Now we're 50 years after that, January 1963, exactly 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, is what I contributed as a memoir to this issue, growing out of the work that I did on Dr. King. It's a very human story that began before the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation's effective date, on his first visit to see the Kennedys. It was a roller coaster ride for Dr. King because he came to have a meeting hoping to get the new frontier with all of this new energy and its pledge during the campaign to end segregation in housing with the stroke of a pen and that sort of thing, to finally change things. He came up for his first private meeting and was dismayed to find out that the agenda for the meetings with the staff was all about his own staff and allegations traceable to J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI that he had too many subversives on his staff and that he needed to get rid of them before the Kennedy administration could even begin to discuss any sort of alliance moving forward. This is a very complex dance, more about control than anything else, because if you admit that you have somebody that you need to get rid of that is subversive, then you've almost ceded control over your agenda and your associates to the other party. So it was a dance about control. It was also a dance for the Kennedy administration that quite rightly knew that it would sacrifice a lot of its political base in the South if it took any meaningful steps against the segregation that prevailed not only in the South, in customs across the country, but it was embedded in the constitutions of the southern states and down into the laws to the point, as Dr. Anderson mentioned, that Emmett Till saw colored and white only signs not only in bus stations but also on public libraries. Black people couldn't go into public libraries or even play checkers together by city ordinance in the city of Birmingham. It was very pervasive. But it was the key to a Democratic president staying in office, so they were quite nervous. And when they had Dr. King up, the agenda about politics was, first, we got to talk about getting you kosher. We got to talk about making sure that you're not a subversive threat, because it's scary enough for us to be in alliance with you, and we're vulnerable if anybody attacks us and says you're in cahoots with wild-eyed radicals. It'll make it that much worse. Now, kind of King was still reeling with this because he had hopes of talking about a more positive agenda. And they kind of made it up to him because they were very skillful socially by saying, would you like to come over to the White House and meet the president? And so he went over there, not on the schedule, not on the books, but he went over there and was escorted up into the residence area of the White House to have lunch with the president and, significantly, with Mrs. Kennedy, Jacqueline Kennedy. The subtle signal there was, you talked politics over on the other side with the staff. This is social. You're supposed to talk to the president about social things. And they did not discuss politics in their first meeting there with the President of the United States. This is October 1961. But they were walking in the lovely corridor up in the residence area down to the Lincoln bedroom after lunch, and when they went through, King managed to get politics in by saying, I see the copy of the Emancipation Proclamation there. We are coming up on the 100th anniversary. Wouldn't it be a magnificent gesture, Mr. President, if you could issue a new Emancipation Proclamation in honor of that one? Just as Lincoln proclaimed slavery to be contrary and freed the slaves by executive order, couldn't you do something similar for segregation and say by executive order the slavery statutes, the segregation statutes violate the American premise, the American foundation of government, therefore I declare them void? The president made a non-committal answer, said that would be interesting, and that he would be willing to hear more about it, whereupon Dr. King went into a long 6 months of preparing a draft proclamation, executive order for President Kennedy in his words to that effect. Now, the reason he thought it would be easier for President Kennedy than passing a law, just as Lincoln found it easier to issue an executive order in the midst of a war as a war order than it would have been to pass legislation to do the same thing. We see now in the Steven Spielberg movie how difficult it was to get the 13th Amendment passed, even when there were no representatives in the House from the Confederate States. It was a cliffhanger. So Dr. King thought it would be easier for President Kennedy to do an executive order than to pass a law. He also, and this is the significant part for me that I'd like to get across to you, it would also be easier for Dr. King. If President Kennedy could end segregation by executive order, then the Freedom Riders, who had just finished coming out of Parchman Penitentiary after a whole summer of Freedom Riders rides in which people were beaten, their buses burned, and they went to jail in Parchman Penitentiary simply for sitting on a bus next to someone of a different race, trying to protest these segregation laws. But the laws were still there. The movement people were coming out of prison. And if President Kennedy and those Freedom Riders had pressured Dr. King to go with them, and he refused to do it, he wasn't ready. And in fact, he quite openly said, these students are ahead of me now. in their willingness to take risks and to make sacrifice for our movement. If President Kennedy issued an executive order ending segregation, King thought it would be easier for President Kennedy. It would also be easier for King because he wouldn't have to join those sit-in students on anything in escalation of the freedom rides. And he was a preacher by training, and he loved oratory. He recognized that the students were doing something necessary because, as a trained orator who had tried and failed since the bus boycott to preach America out of segregation, he knew that there were some things about human nature that are so stubborn that words and oratory and reasoning are not enough. And you've got to amplify it with sacrifice and witness. And this was closing in on him. And in a way, if President Kennedy had issued this order, it was a dream that the movement would be spared, having to go through what it did go through. Now, he spent the whole first part of 1962 preparing this document for President Kennedy in a very, very fancy leather embossed thing that he delivered to the White House in May of 1962, and never heard a word in response, not one. By the time the anniversary of the first issuing of the proclamation, when Lincoln said after Antietam, "I'm going to do this," he announced that he was going to do it on January 1st, effective unless the southern states ended their rebellion. That deadline passed, and he never got any answer from President Kennedy, which dismayed not only King, but a lot of his allies in Congress, because they were hearing that President Kennedy was going to do something dramatic to honor Lincoln. Then King went into a fallback mode and lobbied the White House not to end segregation by executive order, but on the January 1st, 100th anniversary, simply to say that we proclaimed that the United States would spend the year 1963 debating the meaning of the Emancipation and its wider implications in a world of racial segregation. He never got any answer to that either. The White House kept inviting him to social events, and there developed this amazing standoff where Dr. King refused social events at the White House that baffled his fellow civil rights leaders who were desperate to get into the White House on any grounds just to be seen there. He refused to go because until the Kennedy administration responded to his initiatives on the Emancipation Proclamation. All that came to no avail when the anniversary of January 1963 passed, and the Kennedy administration didn't even take the fallback offer. And what we outline in the article in this month's issue is that instead, the Kennedy administration decided to honor the Emancipation Proclamation with a White House reception on Lincoln's birthday in February, a month later, because that would emphasize that the emancipation tradition was really a Republican responsibility, and he invited a lot of Republicans there because it was with trepidation that Democrats approached this issue, since they depended on the solid South of Democrats. I want to make 2 points beyond the significance of that little story, which shows the Kennedy administration a little bit more in context, and Dr. King more in context too, and human struggle and internal struggle over how to approach this issue only 50 years ago. This is not that long ago in the great sweep of time. First of all, this month, 50 years ago, because President Kennedy did not respond to this overture for essentially an easy way out, and also because it had taken 23,000 soldiers to get James Meredith into Ole Miss only a couple of months earlier, Dr. King finally gave up on the notion that there would be an easy way out for the country by political initiative, and just as significantly, an easy way out for him, in the sense that the movement would succeed without him having to take more risk. He said, essentially, we are losing our window in history if it takes all these soldiers to get one black student into Ole Miss. We have not, segregation is as strong as ever, almost 9 years since the Brown decision. if we don't take greater risk, we may lose our moment. And it was in this month that he resolved to go into Birmingham and mount a great challenge to segregation in its bastion city. He go for broke. If we can do something there, we can do something anywhere. And he decided to do that with a resolve that was highly significant, in that he didn't even tell his own father or his own board that he was going to do it, because he knew that they would talk him out of it and raise Cain to stop him. He only started moving and preparing for Birmingham with his most trusted people, most of whom were the very ones that J. Edgar Hoover was trying to get him to get rid of. So that happened in 1963 in January, exactly 50 years ago, that Dr. King decided to commit himself to Birmingham in a world that was segregated not only by race, as you've heard here, but also, compared to today's world, stratified by gender, by condition of life, in every other way you might want to think. Not only were there very, very few female students at my alma mater, the University of North Carolina, by state law. They had to be nursing students. I think it was about 5% of the student body. There were none at the University of Virginia, none, of course, at Yale or Princeton. There were no, let alone West Point. The world that we have today was scarcely imaginable in January 1963. In that same month, also 50 years ago, this same month, George Wallace took office in Alabama with an inaugural address famously pledging segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Looking at a world that was segregated, as I said, by race down into the state constitutions, and that had defined partisan politics in the United States, such that the Democratic Party was the party of white supremacy and the party of segregation throughout the southern states. There was not one single Republican member of the House of Representatives between Texas and the Atlantic Ocean. There were no Republicans. When I grew up in Atlanta, Republicans, as I say, often were as scarce as polar bears. There were only Daddy King's black and tan Republicans who were after patronage jobs, and a few eccentric judges who believed in the two-party system. Everybody else was a Democrat, because the Democrats had ended Lincoln and ended Reconstruction and were the party of solidarity. Since then, this movement transformed politics, transformed our world in ways that we suppress, because we have a terrible history in the United States of making any cross-racial memory comfortable to ourselves at the expense of accuracy, hope, or the promise of liberty. We did it in the Civil War for 100 years, as Nick Lemon makes clear in his contribution for this issue. And what I'm trying to argue is that we have done it for 50 years now in relation to the civil rights movement. The liberations set free in the past 50 years in the world that we don't remind ourselves of, not just in race, not just in gender, not just in gays. The word gay wasn't even invented 50 years ago. It was beyond the imagination of the most visionary liberal. It referred to a crime that dared not speak its name. And now, having set loose all this liberation, what dares not speak its name is the word liberal, to claim credit for the things that it set in motion. And conservatives are debating gay marriage versus civil unions, and yet claiming a triumph for conservative politics in resentment against government that made all these things possible. So what I'm trying to argue for you is that this little moment, this little minuet between Kennedy and Martin Luther King about the Emancipation Proclamation should be a wake-up call for us to remember that we don't remember things across racial lines better, that we improve ourselves, that race is the doorway to discovery, but it is profoundly uncomfortable, even today, for most of the dominant culture, to the point that millions of white people voted for Barack Obama, but they voted for Barack Obama on their terms. And one of their terms is that he not talk about race. As this issue says, he's talked about race less than any president in the last 50 years. I think that's no accident, because we are still limited and turning away from the upside of our own history. So what I'm hoping is that this January 1963 begins a march of 50-year anniversaries that goes forward from now. 1963 and 2013 will be the 50th anniversary of the Birmingham campaign, the dogs and the fire hoses, the death of Medgar Evers, the introduction of the Civil Rights Bill, the March on Washington, the Birmingham church bombing, the Kennedy assassination, the longest filibuster in history in 1964, the '64 Civil Rights Act, then Selma. Most overlooked, the Immigration Reform Act of 1965 in the wake of Selma, which opened up naturalized citizenship to the whole world, repealing a system that had restricted it mostly to the nations of Northern Europe. And Lyndon Johnson said, when he signed it under the Statue of Liberty, never again will the twin barriers of prejudice and privilege shadow the gate to freedom, because it's going to be first come, first serve, and invisibly in the 48 years since, we have communities from all over the world proving that we are not only a pioneer democracy in concept and in evolution, but actually in practice, from all over the world. And these are profoundly inspiring things, and I hope that the next 5 years of anniversaries will help us outgrow and get a more proper balance about the promise of politics, what we can do. We should be profoundly optimistic that we can tackle serious problems once again. But instead, in my view, we are still imprisoned by a Reconstruction post-Civil War blindness that shapes the whole landscape such that we're not even aware of it. We're not aware that we are imprisoned in language that was largely invented by the same George Wallace who failed to protect segregation forever, but in his failure was a genius enough of a politician to invent phrases of resentment and fear against the tides that were liberating America by denouncing pointy-headed bureaucrats in Washington who were trying to tell people how to run their businesses and where they should go to school, and that they were in cahoots with a biased media that had a racial agenda to concentrate all effective power on the central government in Washington with its tax and spend liberals. Every one of those phrases is vintage George Wallace, and every one of them is chillingly contemporary. It is an attitude far more than a judgment that imprisons our politics, shuts us off not only from accurate history, but shuts us off from the promise of democracy. So I'm hoping that this issue of the monthly, focusing on race, and you're focusing on this issue, people's resistance to it, people's resistance to discuss race, to insist simultaneously that race is solved and that it is unsolvable, propositions that have in common only that they both mean we don't need to discuss it. This issue discusses it. The civil rights movement and our history shows us that when we do discuss it, when we get beyond our comfort zones, when we learn things, that's when good things happen. That's when that's the doorway to the promise of freedom. So until we're as comfortable discussing race as we are sports, America is still not there yet, and I hope that we can take advantage of this amazingly resonant time. We're marching through these 50-year anniversaries, and advantage of the articles here to really bring our history back into balance, bring our country back into balance, and address the problems of the future with intelligence and with patriotism. Thank you.